My name is Leona. I'm 35 years old, and I was standing in my parents' dining room on a Tuesday evening in March when my father slid an envelope across the table like it was a bill he was settling. It was thick, the kind of thick that means someone paid a professional to make it official. He didn't open it himself. He nodded at my mother, and she opened it and took out a single sheet, printed, formatted like a list rather than a letter. She read from it in the tone she used for practical matters: the house, the business, a portfolio of accounts, my grandmother's jewelry, each item followed by a name, the same name, every time: Evan. I sat across the table and I listened, and I waited for the part where my name appeared. I was 33 at the time. I had been an operations consultant for 7 years. I had spent my professional life walking into broken systems and identifying exactly where the structure had failed and exactly what it would take to correct it. I was, professionally, someone whose entire value was in seeing things clearly. I waited. My name did not appear. When my mother finished reading, she folded the paper carefully and looked at me with the expression she used when she had already decided something and needed me to understand it had been decided. She said, "You don't need all this, Leona. You've built your own life." I looked at the envelope. I looked at my brother, who was sitting to my father's left with his hands flat on the table in a way that suggested he had known about this before tonight. I said, "Okay." That was the whole conversation. But before I tell you what happened years later, when they showed up at my door, I need to take you back, because that dining room was not where this started. Before I do, if this is your first time here, take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know who's in the room with me tonight. Now let me take you back. I grew up in a household where the roles were established early and quietly, the way foundation cracks form. Not all at once, not loudly, but in the settling over time, until one day you notice the wall isn't straight anymore and you understand it never really was. My father built a business over 30 years. Commercial landscaping contracts, mostly municipal, the kind that require consistency and relationship maintenance and a working knowledge of how city procurement actually functions rather than how people assume it functions. He had started it with 2 trucks and a contacts book and had grown it, through discipline and early mornings and the particular stubbornness of someone who does not know how to stop, into something with 18 employees and a client list that renewed itself because people trusted him. He was good at it. I want to be fair about that because the story doesn't work if I flatten him into something simpler than what he was. He was genuinely good at running that business in the specific way that founders are good at things they built from instinct rather than training. What he was less good at was systems, the kind that survive the person who built them. My mother taught elementary school for 26 years. She was the emotional architecture of the family, the one who translated my father's decisions into narratives the rest of us could live with. She did it with genuine love. That also matters. She was not a cold woman manufacturing justifications. She was a warm woman who had spent decades finding the most generous interpretation of her husband's choices and had become, through practice, very fluent in that language. Evan was the youngest and the son, and in a family like ours, in a culture like the one my parents had grown up in, first-generation household, practical, immigrant-adjacent in its values even though my grandparents had been here for 40 years, those 2 facts meant something structural from the beginning. Not stated, just present the way weather is present. You don't announce the climate, you just build your house to account for it. I was the oldest. I was the daughter. I was, from a fairly young age, the one who figured things out independently, not because I was wired that way specifically, but because independence was what the situation required, and I adapted to the situation. By the time I was in high school, I was managing my own schedule, my own applications, my own everything. Not because my parents were neglectful, but because their attention had a primary direction, and I had learned to work around it without calling it what it was. I called it being capable. It took me longer than it should have to understand that other people were calling it convenient. I left for college on a partial merit scholarship I had applied for myself. My parents contributed what they could. Evan's college fund had been building since he was 3. I did not know this until I was 26 at a Thanksgiving dinner when my mother mentioned it in the casual way people mention things they have long since finished thinking about. I had finished thinking about it too by then, or I thought I had. The business was always going to go to Evan. That was also not stated, but always present. My father talked about it the way people talk about succession in families, where the question of who carries the name forward is still, quietly, the question that matters most. Evan would take over. Evan would carry it. The business would stay in the family because Evan was, in the specific and unexamined way my father used that word, the family's future. What I did professionally was adjacent to that world, but not inside it. Operations consulting. I worked with mid-size companies, regional contractors, logistics firms, small manufacturers, who had grown past the capacity of their original systems and needed someone to come in and redesign the infrastructure so the growth could hold. I was good at it in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's assessment of me, and everything to do with the particular clarity I had developed for seeing how things actually worked versus how the people running them believed they worked. I had, without fully realizing it, spent my 20s building an expertise that was directly applicable to my father's business. Nobody in my family had noticed this, including me. The envelope dinner happened in March. 3 weeks before that, Evan had driven up to visit my parents for a long weekend. A week after he left, my father called me. He said he wanted to bring me in on a conversation about the future of the family assets. He used the phrase bring you in, which I noted, not include you in, not talk to you about. Bring you in, like I was being consulted from outside, rather than addressed as a participant. I drove the 4 hours home on a Tuesday. The meal was my mother's pot roast, which she made for significant occasions. That should have been the first signal. She had been making pot roast for significant occasions since I was 8, and I still did not register it until I was sitting across from the envelope. After my mother said, "You don't need all this," my father said, "Evan is positioned to take this forward. He's been learning the operational side. It makes sense for the structure to reflect that." The operational side, I sat with that phrase. Evan was 29 at the time and had been doing estimating for the business for about 2 years, which was real work and not nothing. But estimating is a single component of a much larger operational structure, and I knew, from my professional life, exactly how much someone can believe they understand a system from one component of it. I said, "What's the plan for the management side? The contracts, the renewals, the city relationships?" My father said, "Evan will handle it. He's ready." He said it the way he had always said things, with the settled finality of a man who makes decisions and does not return to them. I said, "Okay." I drove 4 hours home that night. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because it would be a cleaner story if I did. What I felt was more like the specific internal sensation of having a hypothesis confirmed that you had been hoping was wrong. That particular flatness, not devastation, just arrival at a truth that had been forming for a long time. I went to work the next morning. I took a contract in Cincinnati 2 weeks later and spent 3 months redesigning the procurement system for a regional electrical contractor that had grown faster than its infrastructure. I did good work. I came home. I built my life in the particular way that people build lives when they have understood early that the foundation will have to be their own. The call came 18 months after the envelope dinner. My father called from a number I didn't recognize, which meant he was calling from the office rather than his cell. I noticed that. He said, "We might need to talk." He said it in a voice that was trying to be controlled and was slightly less controlled than he intended. I said, "About what?" He said, "Things are complicated right now with the business." I said, "How complicated?" He said, "I'd rather talk in person." I said, "Okay," and we scheduled something for the following weekend, and after I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and I did what I did professionally when a new client called and said, "Things are complicated." I started thinking about structure. Not emotionally, structurally. I pulled up the company's public records. Municipal contract databases are accessible if you know where to look, and I knew where to look because I had spent 7 years knowing where to look. I found the contract renewal records. I found the city filings. What I found took me about 40 minutes to understand fully and about 4 seconds to recognize the shape of. 3 major municipal contracts had lapsed in the past year, not terminated, lapsed. The distinction matters. Termination means someone ended the relationship. Lapse means nobody followed up on the renewal timeline and the contract expired by default, which is a different kind of failure, quieter, more avoidable, and significantly more indicative of a systemic problem than a relational one. Those 3 contracts had represented, based on the company's historical size and pricing, a substantial portion of the annual revenue. I sat with that for a while. Then I made a separate note, a question I wanted to answer before the following weekend. The renewal timelines on those contracts. When had they been due? Who had been responsible for tracking them? Was there a system in place for that tracking, or had it been managed, as many things in my father's business had been managed, by his personal knowledge of his own relationships rather than by any documented process? I did not call anyone. I went to bed. And in the morning I went to work, and in the evenings that week I researched, and by Friday I had a fairly complete picture of what had happened and why, and it confirmed the hypothesis I had been turning over since Tuesday. On Saturday my parents showed up at my door, not for the scheduled conversation, the day before. They were standing on my front step with my mother holding a ceramic dish covered in foil, which meant pot roast, which meant something significant. I looked at them. My father looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, just in the particular way that people look smaller when a situation has grown past their ability to manage it, and they know it. He said, "We should talk." I said, "Come in." They came in. We sat in my living room, which was not large but was organized and calm, and had exactly the things in it that I had chosen for reasons I had decided. My mother looked around it in the way she had always looked at the spaces I occupied, with the slightly surprised approval of someone who keeps expecting something less. My father put his hands on his knees and said, "The business is having some difficulties." I said, "I know." He looked at me. I said, "I looked at the contract records this week." A silence. My mother said, "Evan has been working very hard." I looked at her. I said, "I know he has." Another silence, the kind that happens when a sentence that was meant to close something has accidentally opened it further. My father said, "We were hoping you might be able to take a look, given what you do." He said it carefully, with the specific care of someone who needs something and has not yet found the language that allows them to ask for it, without acknowledging what the asking means. I looked at my father, at the man who had slid an envelope across a dining room table 18 months ago, with my brother's name on every line. "You don't need all this." He was sitting in my living room on a Saturday morning with pot roast and a business that was bleeding contracts and a son who had been handed a system he didn't understand. And they needed me, not as family, as the person who understood structure, the person they had looked at and said, "You'll be fine," the person they had been right about, just not in the way they had intended. I said, "Tell me what you know about what happened." And I listened, and I noticed, as they spoke, the things they were leaving out, and I understood that the conversation we were actually going to need to have was not the one they had come prepared for. They talked for 40 minutes. My father did most of it. My mother filled in the edges the way she always had, adding texture and softening corners, translating his practical language into something warmer without changing the essential content. It was a practiced dynamic, decades old, and watching it operate in my living room over a ceramic dish of pot roast was its own kind of information. What they told me was this: the business had lost 3 major contracts. Evan had been managing the renewal process but had missed the filing windows. The city relationships my father had built over 30 years required annual maintenance, calls, meetings, the specific and unhurried attention of someone who understands that municipal contracts are as much about relationship continuity as they are about pricing. Evan had been focused on the estimating side, on new business development, on the visible and forward-facing parts of running a company. The maintenance work, the quiet infrastructure of what already existed, had gone unattended. My father said, "He didn't know what he didn't know." He said it without criticism, just as a fact he had arrived at after the fact, which was its own problem. I said, "What about Darren? He was working with you on the accounts side for years." My father looked at the window briefly. He said, "Evan and Darren had some differences in approach. Darren stepped back about 8 months ago." I sat with that. Darren Cole had been my father's accountant for 11 years. He was not a man who stepped back from things lightly or without reason. The fact that he had stepped back 8 months ago, which was approximately 4 months after Evan had taken full operational control, was not a neutral data point. I said, "Did Darren say why?" My mother said, "There were some disagreements about how the books were being structured. Darren has his way of doing things. Evan wanted to modernize." Modernize. I had heard that word used in exactly this way many times professionally. It was the word people used when they were making changes they didn't fully understand to systems they hadn't fully learned. Modernization, in the hands of someone without the foundational knowledge to know what they were replacing and why, had a specific failure signature. I had cleaned up after it 3 times in the past 4 years alone. I said, "What does the current cash position look like?" My father said, "Manageable, for now." For now was doing significant work in that sentence. I said, "And the remaining contracts, the ones that didn't lapse, are they stable?" My father said, "Most of them." Most was also working hard. I said, "Is Evan aware you're here?" A pause. My mother said, "We wanted to talk to you first." I looked at her. She looked at the dish on my coffee table. I understood what that meant. They had come to me without telling Evan, which meant one of 2 things. Either they were concerned enough about the situation to go around him, or they were concerned enough about him to approach me without his knowledge so they could manage the outcome before he knew there was an outcome to manage. Both possibilities told me something. I said, "I'll need to see the books, the actual books, not a summary, and the contract files, the renewal schedules, the correspondence, the filing records." My father said, "Of course." He said it with the particular relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just been offered help and has not yet registered that the help will come with a full accounting of how the weight got there in the first place. They left an hour later. The pot roast was in my refrigerator. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I looked at what I had already found in the public records and I thought about what I hadn't been able to access yet, and I made a list of questions organized by priority. This was what I did professionally. Walk into broken systems, map the damage, find the origin point, identify what was structural versus what was circumstantial, determine what was recoverable and what had already resolved into permanent loss. I was good at it because I had learned over 7 years of client work that the story a system tells when it's failing is almost never the story the people running it believe they are in. The people inside a failing system are always operating on the most recent version of their understanding, which is often several months or quarters behind the actual condition of things. The gap between what they believe is happening and what is actually happening is usually where the real problem lives. I already had a working hypothesis about where the real problem lived in my father's business, but I needed the documents to confirm it. I drove to my parents' house the following Thursday. Evan was not there. My mother mentioned he was in a meeting with a potential new client, which she said with the quiet emphasis of someone presenting evidence of effort. I noted it and moved past it. My father took me to the office, which occupied a converted space in the back of a property he owned 3 miles from the house. I had been there as a child occasionally. It smelled the same, motor oil faintly, paper, the particular industrial warmth of a building that has been a working space for decades. The files were physical. That was the first thing I noticed. Not digitized, not organized in any cloud system, not accessible remotely. 30 years of my father's record-keeping lived in a series of filing cabinets along the back wall, organized in a system that made complete sense if you were my father and partial sense if you were anyone else. Evan had added a folder on a shared drive. I looked at it. It contained estimates, some new client correspondence, and a folder labeled admin that had 4 items in it, none of which were the renewal tracking documents I was looking for. I said, "Where are the renewal calendars, the contract milestone tracking?" My father opened a drawer and handed me a spiral notebook. A notebook. 30 years of contract renewal management for a business with 18 employees and a 7-figure annual revenue lived in a spiral notebook in my father's handwriting. I looked at it. My father said, I always knew when things were due. I've had some of those relationships since the beginning. I said, did you walk Evan through the notebook? A pause. He said, I showed him where it was. Shown where it was, not walked through, not transferred, not documented and systematized so that the knowledge could survive the person who held it. Just shown where it was, the way you show someone where the spare key hangs, trusting that proximity to the thing is the same as understanding of it. I turned the pages of the notebook carefully. The renewal dates were there, clearly noted in my father's precise handwriting. The contact names, the relationships, the specific notes about what each city contact preferred in terms of communication and timing, all of it was there, in a notebook that Evan had presumably seen once and then not consulted, because Evan did not know, and possibly had not been told clearly enough, that the notebook was not a record of the past. It was the operating system of the present. I spent 4 hours in that office. I went through the filing cabinets with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that impatience in a document review is how you miss the thing that matters most. I cross-referenced the physical files with what was on the shared drive. I looked at the last 18 months of bank records my father pulled for me. I looked at the insurance filings. I looked at the equipment maintenance logs, which were also physical, also in a cabinet, also organized in a system that required my father's specific knowledge to navigate. What I found confirmed the hypothesis and then added several layers I had not anticipated. The 3 lapsed contracts were the visible problem. But they were not the original problem. They were the consequence of a deeper structural issue that had been developing since the transition. When my father ran the business, he was the system. His relationships, his memory, his knowledge of every client's preference and every contract's quirk. All of it lived in him, and the business functioned because he was present and attentive and had 30 years of context. The spiral notebook was a backup of his brain, not a replacement for it. When Evan took over, he had inherited the infrastructure without inheriting the knowledge that made it functional. He was working from the visible surface of the business, the estimates, the new clients, the forward-facing activity, without understanding that the foundation of it was relational and historical and documented only in a spiral notebook he had glanced at once. Additionally, and this was the part that required me to sit quietly for a moment when I found it, there were 2 equipment leases that were structured incorrectly, not illegally, just inefficiently in a way that suggested whoever had renegotiated them 8 months ago had not understood the original terms well enough to renegotiate from a position of knowledge. The original terms had been favorable. The new terms were not. The difference, annualized, was not catastrophic, but it was meaningful. And combined with the revenue loss from the 3 lapsed contracts, it produced a cash flow situation that my father had described as manageable, for now with considerably more accuracy than he had perhaps intended. I closed the last folder. I sat in my father's office in the industrial quiet of a Thursday afternoon, and I thought about a dining room table and an envelope and a list with one name on every line. Evan is positioned to take this forward. He's ready. Not because my father had been dishonest. He had believed it. He had looked at his son, who was confident and present and eager, and he had seen readiness. He had not looked for the specific kind of readiness the business actually required, because he had never needed to look for it. It had been native to him. He had not understood that it was a skill set rather than a disposition. He had also, and this was the thing I kept returning to, not looked at me. I had been in the room. I had been doing this exact work for 7 years. I had been sitting across that table and asking about the management side and the contracts and the city relationships, and he had said Evan will handle it with the settled finality of a man who had already decided. Not because I was less capable, because I was not the person he had decided would carry it. I drove back to my parents' house and sat with my father in the kitchen while my mother made coffee. I said, I have a clear picture of what happened. He said, and? I said, the contract lapses were a symptom. The underlying issue is that the business was built around your personal knowledge of it, and that knowledge wasn't transferred when the responsibility was. Evan has been running the visible parts of the company without access to the operational foundation. My father was quiet. I said, "The notebook is the operating system. He didn't know that. That's not entirely his fault." My father looked at his coffee. I said, "There are also 2 equipment leases that need to be renegotiated. The current terms aren't in your favor." He said, "Evan handled those." I said, "I know." Another quiet. My mother said carefully, "Can it be fixed?" I said, "Most of it. The lapsed contracts are the hardest part. 2 of those relationships are recoverable if the approach is right. One of them I'm less certain about. That contact has likely moved on." My father said, "What would it take?" I looked at him. I said, "That's the conversation we need to have. But before we have it, I need to ask you something." He looked at me. I said, "When you made the decision about the inheritance, the house, the business, the accounts, did you think about what the business actually needed to function? Or did you think about who you wanted to carry the name?" The kitchen was very still. Outside, a neighbor's dog was doing something persistent. A car went by. The refrigerator cycled. My father said, "I thought they were the same thing." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I know." I said it without anger because I understood that he had believed that. Entirely. He had built something from instinct and love and 30 years of himself, and he had looked at his son and seen continuation, and he had not known, because no one had told him, and he had not asked, that continuation required more than inheritance. It required understanding. And understanding was the one thing that could not be transferred through an envelope. My mother refilled my coffee without being asked. I wrapped my hands around the cup, and I thought about the conversation that was coming, the one I had not yet had and that they were not yet prepared for, the one where I would need to say clearly what I was willing to do and what I was not willing to do, and what the difference between those 2 things would require from all of us. They thought I was here to help. They had not yet understood that help at this point looked different from what they had imagined when they drove to my door with pot roast and a problem. They thought this was a rescue. I was beginning to understand it was a renegotiation, and they didn't know that yet, but they would. On Thursday, when I came back with the documents, and said the things that needed to be said in the order they needed to be said. I had spent my career walking into rooms where the people in them believed the problem was smaller than it was. I had learned to let them hold that belief until the moment when the truth was the only thing left in the room. That moment was coming. I finished my coffee. I said, "I'll come back Thursday." My father nodded. He looked for the first time since I could remember like a man who understood he was not the one with the most information in the room. That was new. And it was, in its quiet way, the beginning of something neither of us had planned for. I came back on Thursday with a folder, not thin, not symbolic, a working folder, the kind I brought to every client engagement, be organized by section, tabbed, with a summary page at the front that translated the detailed findings into plain language so that the conversation could be about decisions rather than about comprehension. I had made this folder at my kitchen table on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, not with any particular emotion attached to the making of it, just with the same focused attention I brought to every client situation where the gap between what people believed about their system and what was actually true about it needed to be closed carefully rather than all at once. My father was at the kitchen table when I arrived. My mother was making something at the counter that she didn't need to make but needed to be doing. Evan was there. That surprised me, not dramatically, just a recalibration. He was sitting across from my father with his hands around a coffee cup, and he looked up when I came in with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was slightly too careful to fully achieve it. He was 3 years younger than me, and in that kitchen he looked younger than that. Not because he was diminished, because the situation had removed the confidence that usually filled the space around him, and without it he looked closer to his actual age than I had seen him look in years. I sat down. I put the folder on the table. I said, "I'm glad you're here, Evan. This conversation involves you more than anyone." He said, "Dad said you were taking a look at some things." I said, I did." My father said, "What did you find?" I said, "Let me start with what's recoverable, because that's the part that determines what the conversation after this looks like." I opened the folder to the summary page. I walked them through it methodically, not quickly, not with any performance of authority, just the way I walked every client through a system review, one layer at a time, in the order that allowed each piece of information to prepare the ground for the next one. The 3 lapsed contracts first. 2 were recoverable. I had done some preliminary research on the city contacts involved, and both relationships had enough history that a direct, honest approach, acknowledging the gap, offering continuity, demonstrating that the business understood what had happened, had a reasonable chance of reopening the conversation. The 3rd contract was with a department that had already moved to a different vendor and had signed a 2-year agreement. That one was gone. I said so plainly. My father absorbed this without expression. My mother had stopped pretending to cook and was sitting at the counter listening. Evan said, "I reached out to that 3rd one in January." I said, "I saw the email in the file. The timing was 4 weeks after the contract had already been awarded to the other company." He said, "I didn't know the timeline had passed." I said, "I know, the renewal date was in the notebook, but the notebook doesn't have an alarm. It doesn't send a reminder. It worked when Dad was the one reading it every month because he had the relationships in his head and the dates in the book, and both of those things together created a functioning system. Without both pieces, the book is just paper." Evan looked at the table. I moved to the equipment leases. I explained what the original terms had been and what the renegotiated terms were and what the annual difference between them amounted to. I used numbers, specific ones, not to create impact, but because vagueness in a financial conversation is how decisions continue to be made on incomplete information, and I was done with incomplete information in this family. My father said, "I didn't know he had renegotiated those." Evan said the company offered a package. It seemed like an upgrade. I said, "It was an upgrade on the equipment. It was a step back on the terms. The original agreement had a rate lock that the new one doesn't, in a rising market that matters significantly." Evan said, "I should have checked with someone." I said, "Yes." I said it without edge, just affirmation. Then I said, "But you didn't check with someone because there wasn't a clear structure for that. Dad ran the financial decisions himself and Darren provided the accounting framework, and between those 2 things, there was enough oversight. When Darren left, that layer went with him, and there was no documented process for what decisions required outside review. That's not entirely on you. It's a structural gap that existed before you took over." Evan looked at me. I think he had come to this conversation prepared to be blamed. The way you prepare when you know something went wrong under your watch and the person examining it is the one who was passed over when the watch was assigned. I think he had been sitting with some version of defensiveness since my father had told him I was coming back Thursday. What I was saying did not match the conversation he had prepared for. He said, "You're not wrong." I said, "I know." My father said, "So, what do we do?" I closed the folder, not because I was finished with it, because the next part of the conversation was not a document conversation. It was a different kind. I said, "Before I answer that, I want to say something that I think has needed to be said for a while. And I'm going to say it once, and then we're going to move forward because going back and forth on it doesn't help any of us." My mother was very still on her stool. I said, "When you made the decision about the inheritance, you were working from an assumption about who understood the business and what it needed. That assumption was not based on evidence. It was based on something else, something about roles and expectations and who was supposed to carry certain things in this family. I understand where that came from. I am not here to relitigate it, but I want it acknowledged, plainly, that the decision was made without full information, and that the gap in that information is part of what created the situation we're all sitting in now." My father was quiet. He said, "That's fair." He said it simply, no elaboration, no justification wrapped around it. My mother said, "We thought you were the one who didn't need it." I said, "I know you thought that, and I want you to understand something about that framing. You looked at my capability and used it as a reason to give me less. But capability isn't a signal that someone needs nothing. It's a signal that they would do something well. Those are not the same thing." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder my mother kept by the window, red against the gray of a March morning. I watched it for a second and then looked back at the table. I said, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you because I need you to understand the actual situation before I tell you what I'm willing to do about it." My father said, "What are you willing to do?" I said, "I will help stabilize the business. I will help recover the 2 contracts that are recoverable. I will help build a proper operational system so that the knowledge that lives in that notebook lives somewhere that can function without any single person's memory. I will help renegotiate the equipment leases at the next window." I paused. I said, "But I will do it as a consultant, not as a family member doing a favor. I will be compensated at my standard rate. We will have a written agreement about scope and duration and deliverables, and the decisions about how the business is structured going forward will involve my input before they are finalized, not after." My father said, "You want to be paid?" I said, "I want the work to be treated as work, yes." He said, "This is the family business." I said, "And I am a member of this family who was excluded from the family's assets with the explanation that I didn't need them. I have built my own foundation. I am offering to apply that foundation to a problem this family has. I think it's reasonable that the transaction reflects the actual value of what's being exchanged." A long silence. My mother said, "Evan, what do you think?" Evan had been quiet for several minutes. He had been sitting with the folder in front of him, and I could see him reading the summary page, slowly, the way people read things when they are absorbing them rather than performing attention. He said, "I think she's right." My father looked at him. Evan said, "She's right, Dad, about all of it. The notebook, the leases, the contracts, and the other thing." He looked at me. I knew something was off about how it was structured, the inheritance. I knew it when it was happening. I didn't say anything because I benefited from it and because— He stopped, then said, "Because it's easier not to say something when you're on the winning side of it." I looked at my brother. He looked back. He said, "I'm sorry, Leona." He said it plainly, no conditions on it, the direct, undecorated version. I said, "I know." I let it land, and then I moved forward because that was the only direction that produced anything useful. I said, "Here's what I think the next 90 days look like." And I told them. The agreement was signed 2 weeks later. Graham Pike's office, which was becoming a recurring setting in my family's legal history, produced a straightforward consulting contract, standard terms, my rate, a defined scope covering the contract recovery work, the operational systems documentation, and the lease renegotiation. A clause specifying that material business decisions during the engagement period would be reviewed by me before execution. My father signed it at the table in Graham's office with the particular expression of a man who has spent 40 years being the person who decided things and is now, at 67, in a position where the most practical thing he can do is sign a document that redistributes that authority to someone he had not originally chosen. He signed it. That was what mattered. The 2 contracts came back, not immediately. These things don't move quickly when you're dealing with municipal procurement and the specific rhythms of city relationships that had been allowed to cool. It took 60 days of careful work, calls placed at the right time by the right person, which was my father, because those relationships were his and he was still capable, still the man they had trusted, and what the situation required was not replacement, but restoration with better infrastructure behind it. I prepared him for each call. We talked through the approach, the tone, the specific acknowledgments that needed to be made without being made defensively. He was good at it. He had always been good at the relationship part. What he had not understood was that the relationship part required the systematic part underneath it to function reliably. We built the systematic part. The notebook became a database. Simple, not overcomplicated, something a person without specialized training could maintain and read and act on. Every contract, every renewal date, every contact preference, every historical note, documented, accessible, not in anyone's head. Evan learned it. He was a better student than I had expected, which I say not as a surprise at his capability, but as an acknowledgement that the context for his learning had changed. He was no longer the inheritor performing confidence. He was someone who understood now what he hadn't understood before, and that knowledge had made him more careful rather than less. The equipment leases would take longer. The next window was 8 months out. I prepared the documentation and left it structured so that when the window arrived, the negotiation could proceed from a position of complete information. That was how I left it. Not finished, but restructured, built to continue without me needing to be inside it every day. That was the goal. It always was. I was excluded from my family's inheritance with the explanation that I didn't need it. I built my own foundation anyway. My family gave everything to someone who wasn't prepared to sustain it, and 18 months later they came to my door because nothing was working the way they believed it would. I came back with a folder, not a grievance. I said what was true plainly and once. I set conditions that reflected the actual value of what I was offering. I stabilized what was recoverable and documented what needed to exist beyond any single person's memory. And then I stepped back and let the people who owned it run it with better tools than they'd had before. That is the whole story. Now here's the thing I want to leave with you. Capability is not a consolation prize. It is not what you develop because you were not chosen. It is what you develop when you understand early that the foundation will have to be yours and you build accordingly. And there is a particular freedom in a foundation you built yourself that no one can restructure without your involvement. They can exclude you from the inheritance. They cannot exclude you from what you know. The second thing is harder to say, but more important. The people who underestimated you were not always wrong about your capability. They were wrong about what capability means. They looked at your ability to handle things and concluded that you needed nothing. But handling things well is not evidence of needing nothing. It is evidence of what you would do with something if it were given. Remember that the next time someone uses your strength as a reason to give you less. And one more thing, because I think it matters. Evan said I'm sorry at a kitchen table on a Thursday morning without any scaffolding around it. No justification. No because. Just the words in their plain form. I want you to notice that. Because in a world where accountability is often delivered wrapped in explanation, a clean apology from someone who benefited from your exclusion is not nothing. It does not fix what was broken, but it is the beginning of something honest. And honest is the only foundation anything real can be built on. I'm going to end today with a question, and I'd like you to sit with it genuinely. If someone handed you less and called it appropriate, and you built something extraordinary with what remained, what did you do with the moment when they finally saw it? Did you let them back in? Did you set conditions? Did you walk away? Tell me in the comments. Tell me your first name and your city. I want to know who is at this table. And if this story found something in you that needed finding, sit with that for a moment. Because someone in your life is probably standing in a dining room right now listening to a list, waiting for their name. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another story waiting. I'll see you in the next one.